India is one of the hotspots of international politics. It is the most populous country in the world, the largest democracy on the planet, and for many, the key player in the conflict between the United States and China. And no wonder, companies like Apple plan to produce more and more parts of their devices there. Google, Microsoft, and even OnlyFans all have Indian CEOs. And whichever way we look at it, what is clear is that the future will be determined by this country. Even so, Visualeconomik community, we haven't come to you today to talk about the future of the Bengal tiger, but rather about its past. Despite its promising future and enviable recent trajectory, India remains a very, very poor country, much poorer than African countries such as Morocco or Algeria. But this has not always been the case. Hundreds of years ago, European traders marveled at the riches of the subcontinent, with its spices, fabrics, and monuments like the Taj Mahal. What happened for one of the richest and most prosperous regions on the planet to end up being one of the poorest places in the world? For many economists and historians, the answer has a clear name: the British Empire. Between the 18th and 20th centuries, British officials completely plundered the Indian subcontinent, turned its people into semi-slave labor, starved millions to death, and condemned the country to underdevelopment. Or at least, this is the theory that many historians argue. As it happens, we're facing a really complicated and controversial subject, which is still under debate today. On Visualeconomik, we will unravel the story, tell you how the British changed India's economy and development, explain the origin of its poverty, and make today's question clear. Is India terribly poor because of the British? Let's get started. Is it true that the British plundered and enslaved the Indians? Well, I'm afraid so. Just take a look. This gentleman is Robert Clive. Back in the 18th century, he was probably the richest man in the whole world. The Elon Musk of 300 years ago. Robert was the architect of the expansion of the British East India Company. And why was he so rich? Because he took advantage of his power to plunder the territories he conquered. He got rich by stealing from the Indians. And the worst thing is that he was not the only one. British officers gave themselves salaries equivalent to more than 100 times the average of what Indian citizens earned. And where did they get the money? Indeed, by raising taxes on farmers. When the British Raj took control of India, it collected twice as much tax as the rulers of the Mughal Empire had. According to estimates by great economists such as Angus Maddison, the amount of the robbery in today's money would be between 40 and 100 million pounds. But hold your horses for a minute. While it is true that there were Britons who amassed a veritable blood-stained fortune, this alone cannot explain the country's economic backwardness. Notice that the evolution of wealth in India is shown on the screen. It is true that during the period when the British ruled, the region's GDP per capita only fell. However, this was not their fault. India had already been in economic decline for more than a century. So what does this mean? Basically, that it's difficult to know whether the poverty spiral was simply a downward trend or whether the British made it even worse. And yes, I know that a moment ago I said that the British looted 100 million pounds, but although it may seem like a lot, putting that figure in perspective, we would be talking about between 0.04 and 0.07% of the national income between 1840 and 1900. In other words, although terrible, it was economically irrelevant. However, the story goes much further, because if we're talking about the British government in India, we must talk about the terrible famines during the almost 200 years of colonialism. India has been a country regularly hit by waves of famine. Nevertheless, until the arrival of the British, the Mughal rulers helped the citizens in bad times by lowering taxes by as much as 100%. Yet, when the British arrived, not only did they not lower taxes, they increased taxes even in times of famine. And as you can imagine, the consequences were dire.
The British company did not engage in any famine relief work, even though the government had more than enough cash reserves to do so.
The British increased the number of deaths due to famine by up to 30 million. Many analysts have even compared the United Kingdom to Holocaust Germany. It was truly brutal. Even so, the British realized their mistake. Beginning in the 20th century, the British Raj began to fight famine. It invested a lot of money in canals to alleviate droughts. The area irrigated by the government increased threefold between 1885 and 1938. And after that, barring the Second World War, famines in India became history. So despite British economic atrocities, famines don't seem to be the main reason India was economically wrecked either. And faced with this, there is another theory that may gain much more weight: the theory of deindustrialization. By the mid-18th century, India had such an advanced manufacturing industry that it produced a quarter of all textile goods on the planet. Cotton, silk, muslin. Indians were the Silicon Valley of fabrics. But just 100 years later, it all came crashing down. The Indian textile industry collapsed. While we said earlier that they produced a quarter of all global manufacturing, by the 19th century that figure plummeted to 3%. What was the reason behind this fall? First of all, the great powers of the time, such as the United States, imposed heavy tariffs against India. But secondly, with the Industrial Revolution, Europeans developed more advanced textile machinery that swept the global market in terms of competitiveness. Yet, the story goes much deeper than that. The British forced India to buy many of their products. However, they did not allow the Indians to sell theirs on European soil. So a system of free trade existed between the United Kingdom and India, but only in favor of the British. And many argue that this was the final straw in their already decimated textile sector. Now, there are a couple of things to keep in mind here. On the one hand, when the Mughal Empire disintegrated at the end of the 17th century, and decades before the British arrival, it unleashed a long period of instability, continuous wars, and climatic phenomena that caused years of recurrent droughts and that depleted any industrial production. So what can I say? It doesn't seem fair to attribute the entire mess to trade with the UK either. Because it's true, many industries closed down because they could not trade, but many others grew and benefited from access to cheaper foreign products. The truth is that in the deindustrialization of India, there were winners and losers. In fact, in the mid-19th century, Indian industry re-emerged like a phoenix. See this? In 40 years, wages in the industrial and service sectors doubled, while wages in agriculture, which occupied about 70% of Indians, remained stagnant. In this period, India had a highly diversified and competitive industrial sector, where textiles were still the main production, but only occupied 25% of the total. Indian industry was relatively strong, although it came at the cost of wages far below those in other countries. This caused factories to specialize in very labor-intensive processes. That is, with a lot of labor and few machines. At the end of the day, why would business owners invest in technology if they already had cheap workers? To have a sustainable growth model in the long term? Rubbish! To give you an idea, the ratio between the number of workers and machines in the Bombay cotton mills was the highest in the world. Now, besides that, the real negative point, the big drag on the Indian economy, was agriculture. Agriculture was a sector trapped in a vicious cycle of low income, low investment, and low wages. Indians were not able to move from the countryside to the industrial areas to help move the country forward. The reasons? They're not very clear, but possibly the oppressive caste system, or the fact that women married very early. Forming a family in the native village had a lot to do with it. And in this regard, the British did little to improve the situation. However, let's slow down for a moment, because after all that we have seen comes the surprise, the alternative theory. There are economists who argue that the British Empire was not only not bad, but beneficial to the Indians. And one of their main arguments has to do with the railroad. What you are looking at is a map of the Indian Railroad of the early 20th century. Its construction was the greatest feat of the British in the subcontinent. We're talking about the 4th largest railway network in the world, a megastructure that created 10 million jobs. The railroad was a true economic revolution. Between 1870 and 1913, it was responsible for 20% of all economic growth. Until its arrival, markets had been very local. But after it was established, goods were able to travel from regions with better harvests to those that yielded less. The price of food plummeted. Items such as salt, which, fun fact, had such a horrendous tax that it inspired Gandhi's marches, became 87% cheaper in 40 years. We're talking about more than 140 million tons of goods being moved on these rail tracks by 1940. However, as with the previous arguments, there are a few nuances to be made here as well. It has already become a motto of this channel. The devil is in the details. The railroad was spectacular, yes, but what if it could have been so much better? You see, in the US, a mile of railroad cost on average about £2,000. So let me ask you, how much do you think it cost in India? Double? 5,000? 10,000 pounds maybe? Well, nothing like that. Each mile cost £18,000. 9 times more than in the US. And that's with much, much cheaper labor. So what is the reason, you may ask? Well, they wanted to build the railroad very quickly. To do this, the government needed to attract tons and tons of private investment, and guaranteed investors a a minimum return of 5%. The problem? The problem is that with guaranteed profits, companies could splurge. Think about it. It's always better to take 5% of 100 than 5% of 10, right? But well, you can imagine the corruption that took place in this regard. Not surprisingly, apart from the railroad, UK advocates argue that the British also brought to India such important institutions as parliamentarianism, British law, and the English language. But were they really such important breakthroughs? Well, parliamentarianism is all very well, yes, but the Indians did not benefit from it until well after independence. As for British law, indeed, it is also recognised as one of the best in the world. The problem is that perhaps it was too complex for the level of development of India. In the end, it all resulted in endless trials, swamped with bureaucracy. And about the language, well, what can I say? The CEOs of the big companies we mentioned have certainly come out ahead, but only 10% of Indians speak English. Modern Indian governments are traumatized by the British, hate them, and many of them refuse to teach English in public schools because it is the language of the colonizers. Do you want an example? In Telangana province, only 0.6% of students in public schools learn English. Ultimately, the only ones who can learn English are the rich children who go to private schools, where the figure is over 80%. But at this point, I know that many of you will be thinking that we have left a big topic untouched. What happened to public property? How much did the English invest in health and education? Well, this is another epic fail of the British Empire. Spending on health and education accounted for only 4% of the total in the 1900 budgets. The British Raj was spending on public services. Basically, half of its budget was spent on defense and administration. And let's see, don't get me wrong, Southeast Asia in the 19th century was anything but peaceful, so defense spending was reasonably justified. But still, why did the British Raj spend so little on education or healthcare? There are two reasons. The first is that the Raj had a very, very small budget. But wait a minute, didn't we say that the British taxed the farmers? Well, yes, they did, but farmers actually represented a smaller and smaller part of the economy. And the problem with the Raj is that it relied heavily on land taxes because they were the easiest taxes to collect, which meant that they ended up getting very little public money. So why didn't they use public debt? Well, the answer may surprise you. To satisfy the Indian nationalists who were opposed to indebtedness. They viewed the interest payments as a rent extraction from the British in London on the local Indians. But there were also racist and political motivations in this matter. The British did not really want to invest in education and health, and the proof of this is that in India there were some territories called principalities, where the rulers were Indians, not English. And do you know what happened? In the princely states under Indian rule, moderately more was invested in education and healthcare. In short, the British were neither angels nor demons. They had their own interests. They persecuted, they punished, especially the poor peasants, with taxes and plunder. But it should also be recognized that they helped by means of setting up institutions, investments such as the railroad, and aided the fight against droughts during the 20th century. But at this point, it's your turn. Do you think the British were a negative or positive influence on India? What would India be like today if colonialism had never happened? Do you know any more facts or anecdotes about British rule? You can leave me your answers in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week. So subscribe to this channel, hit the little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you liked this video, like it, and I'll see you in the next one. All the best. See you next time.